Hi, my name is Christine Harrington, and I'd like to talk to you today about online learning. This is an introductory exploration of what online learning is so that you can get a better handle on this type of learning environment. So, online learning, as you know, is an alternative to the traditional classroom model. With the internet and lots of technology at our fingertips, it's really easy to think about how we can use and embrace those technology tools to help students learn the content that they need to learn and develop the skills that they also need to learn in a college environment. It's really increasing in popularity. If you look at this chart here, you can see back in 2000, there were only about 8% of the students or so who were taking online courses, and this is in the higher ed environment. And this now has grown to about 20%. So approximately 1 in 5 students are taking the online courses. So this is a trend that's obviously growing. And this data is from 2007-2008, was reported in 2011 by the U.S. Department of Education. They also looked at the nature of the student body who was taking the online courses. And not surprisingly, students at 2-year public schools were taking more online courses than students in the 4-year schools and other environments. And many of these students were of non-traditional age. So many of the students who were over 30, who were married with children, kind of use the online courses as a way to access education in the midst of their very busy lives. And this was also true for students with mobility disabilities. They were more likely to take the online courses. Again, we're really looking at accessibility issues here. So what the online courses do is they really offer an alternative to the traditional classroom that really increases the accessibility to education for our student body. Now let's look at this. Is it a good idea? Well, certainly there are advantages and disadvantages to every teaching environment. The clear advantages are the flexibility and convenience. So if you perhaps have a job that changes hours and you can't commit to coming to class on Mondays at a certain time, then this is going to be ideal for you. You also can reduce the need for travel time, which maximizes your time as a student, keeping all of your learning in the environments in which you're already functioning. There are some academic benefits as well, and one of those academic benefits is that you can really engage in much deeper, more meaningful conversations. So if you think about what happens in a traditional classroom and you're having a discussion, what generally happens is you may get 4 or 5 students to be highly engaged in that discussion, and many of the other students may not engage at all or in a much more minimal way. Well, in an online environment, there's no place to kind of hide. Everyone has to participate. And not only do you get to hear from all of your students, but you also get to have increased interactions among the students. So all the students are also interacting with one another. Now, the nature of those conversations, in addition to getting to know the different members of the class better, is also usually at a much higher level. You can ask students to reflect and think about course content, whereas in the traditional classroom setting, when you ask a question, you're going to get on-the-spot answers from those handful of students who often, have opinion-based responses. And in this kind of environment, you can ask students to go above and beyond their opinions and back it up with data, which is hard to do in an in-person, on-the-spot conversation. But online, it's really not difficult to do at all. You provide them access to the information, and then they need to use those resources to engage in the conversations. Now, the disadvantages are sometimes students have a hard time figuring out what is the most important content. It can be a little overwhelming. In class, we use a lot of tools to draw attention to what is most important, and we might emphasize those, repeat those, do those over and over again in different ways and using different tools in the classroom. So it is a little bit more challenging for students to figure out what's the kind of big ideas versus the smaller details. Remembering they're not experts in the content yet like you and I are. And the other issue is that although we do have more connections between students, sometimes they're a little bit less personal. Online dialogues obviously, lack the nonverbal and some of the other really important communication parts of our conversations. So we may get to know folks, but it may be in a less personal way. And of course, it requires a ton of self-discipline. This is actually true about all learning, but in particular, the online learning, there's no structure in terms of, you must log on Mondays at 9 a.m. So you need to build that structure in for yourself. So as a student, if you lack self-discipline, that's certainly going to be problematic. Now, it's really important for you to understand that online learning is not an independent study. So it's not just throwing some resources at students and having them read materials and gain content knowledge. You know, content knowledge certainly is a key element of our academic courses at the undergraduate level, but it's not the only skill that we're trying to teach students. We're also teaching students teamwork and collaboration and many of the other what I'll call soft or transferable skills that employers are looking for. And an online course is no different than a traditional course. It is a class, which means we're learning in the context with others. And this is very much backed up by psychological theories and educational theories, where there are many folks like Vygotsky and Goswami who emphasize that we are social learners and we're going to learn best when we're engaged with others. So one of the key challenges is trying to create that community of learners in the online world. It's a lot easier to do that in person because you have them and you can engage them in in-person conversations. And everyone's together at the same time. In the online environment, everyone is probably not together at the same time unless you're using some synchronous tools like chat or Skype, but most online classes are asynchronous really because the need of the students taking it is the flexibility factor. So it may be that they can't find that day and time to log in on a consistent basis. They may need different times. So you do want to create a community of learners, and one of the best ways to do that is really using the online discussion boards. In Campus Cruiser, that's called Message Board. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. So when you're getting ready to teach an online class, the first thing you need to do is think about how can I design this? And of course, all courses start with looking at your end goal. So what are you trying to accomplish in that class? And it really does require a fresh look. You can't just take what you normally do in an in-person class and throw it into an online class. There will be pieces and elements that will work just fine for, and then some of it is not going to work fine. So you don't want to just try to take one, model that you have, your traditional classroom model, and just try to force fit it into the online model. That often runs into problems. Instead, you want to take a fresh look at your course. You want to revisit what your learning outcomes are. So what is it that you're trying to accomplish? That is really the goal. Now, at Middlesex, we have course learning outcomes defined by the department, so you'll need to take those, and that'll kind of be your driving force. Now you need to figure out, okay, well, how can I provide and organize the content for those course learning outcomes? In a traditional class, I'm going to show up and I'm going to lecture, I'm going to engage you in group discussions and activities. Well, what am I going to do in the online environment? So we need to look at both how am I going to get that content to you, how am I going to organize that content since I won't be there personally to draw attention to what's most important, and then what kinds of tasks are going to be important and students doing in order for them to learn the course objectives or outcomes. And then of course you also need to have assessment tools. So how will you assess whether or not they did in fact learn what you wanted them to learn by the end of the semester, and what kind of feedback can they get along the way? In fact, one of the other advantages of online is that there's often a lot of feedback and you don't have to wait necessarily till we're in class again to review something. You can get feedback and start using it the next day. So it's really kind of a interesting process. Now, one of the other factors that's really important to consider is accessibility and universal design. So when you're putting your course together, and we'll have another module where you'll get to explore some, documentation and some research in this area, some tips, and even more importantly, on how to make your courses more accessible. Universal design basically means you're setting the stage right from the start so that it meets the needs of all learners. So you're not kind of doing accessibility as an add-on afterwards scenario. Oh my, I have a student in my class who's going to need this. What am I going to do to fix that? Instead, universal design is really about how can I make my course so that it's accessible to everyone, whether there's someone with a hearing impairment, vision impairment, learning disability, etc. So you really want to look at some of those issues and try to make sure you address those at the onset versus afterwards. So just a couple more words about the course design. This course mapping concept is very, very important. I mentioned before that we want to start with our learning outcomes, figure out what tasks are needed, and then finally the assessment. It's very important that you're constantly linking things. So you're not just throwing content up. Well, why do you want them to read that website? How is that going to connect back to this learning outcome? Why is this article so critical? Why do they need to engage in a conversation about this? And you want to really challenge yourself to make sure that these links are very explicit, not only in your mind, but also tell students exactly the link so that they understand the rationale behind the learning tasks and all the assessments that you use. As I said before, this organizational piece is really, really important. So you can't just take all your hard copy stuff and throw it on the computer. I've seen a lot of online classes where it's just endless links to different websites. So what do you want me to do when I get to this website? You know how websites are. They can link out. I could spend days and days on many of the websites that you might send me to. But what's the purpose of sending me there? So we don't want students to be overwhelmed by the number and amount because, as you know, there's an enormous amount of content out there. So your job as the professor is to organize that content and prioritize what you'd like them to look at. So although if you did a search on a topic within your course, you might come up with thousands of hits in Google. We're not going to send students to thousands of links. First of all, A, they wouldn't have the time to look at all those. And B, without your expertise as the professor, they're not going to take in that information as effectively. So there are tools within Campus Cruiser where you can organize your content. One of those tools is my course designer, and that kind of packages so that all the links are packaged together, and that is a great tool to use, especially in an online class. So students know exactly where they should begin and how they should proceed. So now let's talk about the teaching part of online. Once you've designed your course, now it's time to teach it. So I'm going to just bring your attention to Chickering and Gamson's seminal work. This was done back in 1987, and basically what they did was they identified the best teaching practices. Now this was not for online learning, it was really just about teaching practices. But as you take a look at these different practices, they are clearly not just about the traditional classroom. It's important to make sure that we're doing best teaching practices regardless of the delivery mode that we're using. So I encourage you to think about these different tasks and make sure that you are incorporating them. And you again can go and read Chickering and Gamson's original work so you can get a better understanding of all of those different practices they've outlined. Now, online courses are unique, so we do need to take a few minutes to just talk about what is unique about them. And one of the biggest differences really is the faculty role. You're not standing in front of them leading them for 3 hours a week. Instead, you are expertly choosing resources and tasks, and then you are managing and facilitating conversations. So, what Boca and Conrad say is that the role kind of shifts to one of a coach or a mentor. So it really is more of that guide on the side, because you are certainly needing to be present in the class. It's not about just throwing all the material up there and letting them follow it through for the semester. In fact, it's very critical. Research shows that presence, and faculty presence in particular, is very important in terms of academic achievement in the online courses. But you need to rethink your role, and what is your role going to be in this course versus a traditional class. And then most of the meetings are asynchronous, which means that we're not all logged in at the same day and time. So it may not be a live conversation. There's going to be a delay. And that can be positive, as I said before, because it allows you to dive back into the content and really engage in a more meaningful way with classmates. But sometimes the lack of feedback immediately is a little frustrating. So it's something that everyone needs to get used to. In terms of active learning, the learner in this online environment, it has to be more independent and needs to take on more of an active role, because they are the ones that are going to be learning the content by using the online resources that you've provided. The flexibility is there. So as we said before, we can break maybe content up into different kinds of chunks. Maybe they don't need to sit down for an hour and a half like a traditional class and engage with the content. Maybe instead they're gauging, 15 minutes or 20 minutes a day, or maybe it's twice a day, whatever the amount of time is. And I'm talking just in terms of initial content, not really further exploring it. It should be the same amount of time that they invest, whether it's a traditional or online class, but the way in which that time is invested can vary. So it may be spread out over 7 days instead of just on 1 or 2 days in the traditional classroom setting. And this ongoing assessment is really important so students can get a sense of how they're doing immediately. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean they only get feedback once a week. They might be getting feedback daily from you as the instructor because you're commenting in the conversation boards, and you might be providing quiz or assignment feedback throughout the semester as well. So when you're teaching an online class, the first part you need to think about is, how am I going to teach that content? How do I deliver that? Well, it's delivered in a variety of ways. You certainly can do some videos. So if you'd like to take what you normally do in a classroom, there might be times when you want to explain that, and it may be in a video way, it may be in a narrated way. You certainly, again, want to just make sure you consider accessibility issues. And that could be a great way to really teach online, so students can kind of look at those lectures, and they can look at them more than once if they need to, which is certainly one of the benefits of online learning. But it's not the only way that you can teach. You can also do more of the just-in-time teaching, so teaching kind of when they need it. So let's say you're doing online conversations through message board. Well, you pose a question to them, and then the students are answering and engaging with one another around those questions, but then you can jump in and do some teachable moments, throughout the conversation, and even maybe summarize it all at the end. So there's lots of different ways to engage in the teaching piece of it. You need to figure out what's going to work best, again, considering what your learning outcomes are and the tasks that you'll include. The second and third one are really important because in addition to teaching the content, we really need to engage students with one another. So we want to create connections with our students, not just professor to student, but also students to students. And that, as we know, is one of the key retention tools, because students are less likely to withdraw from classes or from college if they feel connected to one another. And as I said before, some of the skills that they learn in that process are going to be really, really valued by future employers. So getting those connections can be a little bit more challenging when you're not all online at the same time, but the online discussion boards are really one of the best ways to do that. And there are other modules in this course where you're going to be further exploring how to do that in the online discussions. So how do you facilitate those conversations? One key pointer is to not let students just do the "I agree with you" statement, because that does not engage students and it makes the message board then kind of tedious. Instead, I like to use Socratic questions and just show my students how to use those questions, and then they can answer questions back and forth with one another. It's really important to not only engage, but also to challenge our students. So the assignments and all that we give our students, they need to be meaningful, they need to see the value in them, but they also need to be pushing them to develop the skills that we're trying to help them develop. So we don't want it to be busy work that's meaningless. We want to make sure all of our assignments are directly connected to our learning outcomes and are going to help them achieve at a high level. So the last thing we'll talk about is, are these courses successful? Well, the research out there on online learning is mixed. There certainly are a number of studies that show that students do not do as well in online courses as they do in the traditional courses. And part of that is because sometimes their expectations aren't clear. They may view it as easier. They may not realize, how much self-discipline really is needed. In truth, not all online courses are created effectively by faculty either. So they may be lacking those senses of engagement, and many students may be taking online courses that in truth are more like independent studies, which is not really the case that we want to do at Middlesex. We want to have really high quality online courses. So the idea here is that there's some research out there that does show online courses can meet with equal or even better success than traditional courses. But it all depends on how that course is set up and the expectations of the students when they sign up, as well as student variables. Some of the student success variables that have been identified by the research are students who are self-disciplined tend to do better, and that's true actually in non-online courses also in the traditional model as well. Time management is obviously going to be important. They need to be able to prioritize and strategize about how they're going to accomplish all the tasks that need to be done. Students who are motivated, and as you saw in the beginning of this presentation, many of them are non-traditional students, so they may be very motivated to go back and get education that might be a career change. It might be that they just lost a job and need to retrain. Lots of different reasons to be motivated, but having that high level of motivation certainly is important. And believing believing in your ability to be successful is also connected with success. Now, the good news is that as a faculty member, we really can impact all of these factors. We can motivate students. We can engage them through individual conversations online, through our online discussion boards. We can also help them manage their time by setting up, when drafts might be due of projects and then having the final project done, maybe even setting it up so peers can kind of provide support and feedback to one another before things are graded. So there's lots of ways for us to kind of increase their confidence and motivation. And I encourage you to really strategically think about how you can impact these student factors that may not be completely within your control, but certainly you can have an impact on. So I hope this provided you with a nice overview of what online learning is, and the other modules in this course are going to dive obviously much more deep into the specific content of designing and teaching.